You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing. Today, we present the second of our two episodes devoted to Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, as we interview its translator and editor, Michael Katz. In part one, we discuss Dostoevsky and his career and the legacy of this masterpiece. In this second episode, we learn more about Michael Katz's personal experience with this novel, his first encounter with Dostoevsky's work, his favorite line in the novel, the significance of the epilogue, and so much more. Michael Katz is Professor Emeritus of Russian and East European Studies at Middlebury College. In addition to his writings on 19th century Russian literature, he has translated over 15 Russian novels into English, including works by Turgenev, Tolstoy, and of course, Dostoevsky. He previously joined Norton Library Podcast for a discussion of his edition of Nikolai Gogol's Selected Tales. We're delighted he could join us again today. Michael Katz, welcome back to the Norton Library Podcast.
Thank you.
It's great to see you again, and we're looking forward to talking more about Fyodor Dostoevsky and his great novel, Crime and Punishment, and your magnificent translation of it. Michael, I'm holding in my hand a copy of the Norton Library edition. Very beautiful with your introduction, your annotations. We always ask this because there's such geniuses at the Norton offices. Is there a reason for this particular design or color scheme? We have a light gray and maybe like a light bluish gray, and then a kind of a cinnabar or brown at the bottom. Is this Dostoevsky themed at all?
Well, it is. The blood of the old woman and her sister are notable in the first book, the murder of the pawnbroker and her innocent sister. And then Raskolnikov himself becomes blood-stained as a result on his clothes and his hands. And then at the end of book 2, so that's the way book 1 ends. At the end of book 2, poor Marmeladov, the drunk whom he meets in the tavern, is run over by a cart and a horse, and his body is covered with blood, and he's carried back home to his apartment, and dies on his sofa. So the first two murders in the book are both blood-stained.
Yeah, the Norton Library edition always has thematically relevant color schemes. So I'm glad I was able to ask you about this and what it conjures up. Do you remember when you first read Crime and Punishment?
I do.
Was it in Russian or was it in English?
No. It was in English. My private high school in New York City added Russian to its curriculum, and I decided that I would try it and liked it very much. At the same time, I began reading the Russian classics in translation. Crime and Punishment, Anna Karenina, War and Peace, and the Brothers Karamazov. And those are really the four greatest masterpieces in Russian fiction. And I thought to myself, if I study Russian long enough, I might be able to read these books in the original. I didn't quite realize how long it would take. If I knew, I might not have pursued my Russian studies, because it wasn't until I was a junior at college that I was able to read them in the original.
That's still pretty impressive, though. That's a pretty good ascent to do it in that span of time.
I had good teachers, including a wonderful countess, emigre countess, who grew up in Petersburg and who played in the playground, as she used to say, right next door to the Tsar's children who were playing in their private playground. Hers was the aristocratic playground.
Would you have read it in the Constance Garnett translation?
I think it was David Magershak, who at the time was the more popular translator. But I
mean,
don't really recall who was the original translator that I read.
This novel has undoubtedly been translated dozens of times, correct?
Yes.
Are they markedly different one from the other?
Many of them are British and not American, and a number, including Constance Garnett. And she was living in Moscow with her husband, who was a diplomat or businessman in Moscow. She learned Russian herself, and her Russian was good, but it was not terrific. She made mistakes, so there are inaccuracies in her versions and what translators like to call infelicities. And I decided that it was a long time later, that I would try to do it myself, return to that. I did many other books before that, before I dared try a masterpiece like Crime and Punishment. In fact, Norton wrote to me and said, could I recommend somebody to translate Crime and Punishment? And I wrote back and I said, me, of course.
So you've done Karamazov and Crime and Punishment. Have you done any other Dostoevsky books?
I just published a translation of The Idiot. It's just out, and its official publication date is in the summer, but they sent me an advance copy. And I am translating The Gambler now, which is his most autobiographical book, as he describes his life in Wiesbaden at a casino in Germany on the Rhine, where he plays roulette and falls in love with femme fatale.
I remember in our previous episode, we were talking about the challenges of reading Crime and Punishment, to say nothing of translating it. We were saying the names and how slippery that can be, and that can fluster new students. I can imagine some of our Norton Library listeners saying, like, oh, I would love to read Crime and Punishment. It's such a big Russian novel, and they find it intimidating. Is there a way to enter that to make it a little bit less awesome?
I can tell you an experience that I had when I was teaching it in a course in Texas. And I was in the classroom and we were discussing the novel for the first time. And I said, so what is your reaction to this novel? And they shared their initial reactions, some saying that it was so long and they weren't sure they were going to get through it. And one student in the back row raised his hand and said, I want to say something that nobody else has said. And I said, well, go ahead, John, speak up. And he said, it's a damn good book. And I thought, the joys of teaching. This is wonderful.
Thumbs up.
Yes, it's a detective novel.
Yeah.
So it's gripping. You write from the very beginning, as Raskolnikov is going through this rehearsal of his crime and then committing the actual crime before the first 50 pages are out. One student said, this is a strange book. You spend 50 pages committing a crime and 550 pages wondering why.
That's great. Is the philosophical debate that Raskolnikov goes through, is that challenging, or does Dostoevsky present it to the reader in an approachable way?
I think it's in an approachable way. He tries out different motivations and he has them shot down by Sonia, the heroine, as he figures out, as he gets closer and closer to why he did it. So each motivation is laid out and you're sort of hooked and you see, aha, that's why he did it. And then Sonia says, no, that's not it. It couldn't have been that. Or Raskolnikov himself admits, no, that's not right. He says at one point, I didn't kill the old woman, I killed myself. And that's a fascinating idea that somehow he has murdered his own immature adolescent self, and he's now searching for a new identity. And he does find one at the end with Sonia's help.
You talk about this as a detective novel. What can you tell us about the detective?
Oh, the detective, Porfiry Petrovich, is one of my favorite characters in the book. He's a man who's unmarried, has no family, and he is looking at Raskolnikov, I believe, as a substitute son as well as a mentor. He has regard for Raskolnikov's intellect and thinks that Raskolnikov could be a great lawyer someday, go to law school and join Porfiry Petrovich in his profession. This is fascinating, and you get a sort of paternal relationship between Porfiry Petrovich and Raskolnikov.
Do you have a favorite line in Crime and Punishment?
I do. It's the next to last line in the novel, and it says, that's the beginning of a new story, the story of the gradual renewal of a person, the story of his gradual rebirth and gradual transition from one world to another, of his getting to know a new, hitherto completely unknown reality. And this is the line. This could become the theme of a new narrative, but the present one is ended. I think that's a great way to end the novel. And he then writes 4 more novels in which he develops similar themes, faith and disbelief, good and evil, afterlife, the question of an afterlife. These are the same questions that he will examine in each one of his major novels.
So when he uses the word rebirth, does that have something to do with what you were just saying when he kills one version of himself and he awakens to a new identity?
Absolutely. His new mature identity, which is going to be a person who knows the difference between right and wrong and acknowledges his own culpability. When he first confesses at the end of book 6, he's only confessing to the crime. He's not confessing to the transgression. The word crime in punishment is prestuplenia, and that means, if you break it down into its roots, a stepping over. And the word perestuplenia, with an extra E in it, means a transgression, a moral or legal transgression. So Raskolnikov at the end of 6 admits that he has violated human law, but he doesn't admit that he's transgressed moral law. It takes the epilogue and Sonia and his terrible dream in the epilogue for him to acknowledge that he's really a moral transgressor. So every time the Russian reader encounters the title Crime and Punishment, the word crime is really resonant on 2 levels, the legal level and the spiritual level.
When you're saying spiritual, if he's committing a moral transgression, is that related to religion, or is it related to subjective morality?
It's related to religion, but he doesn't acknowledge that until the very end of the novel. And even then, we're not sure that's the path he's going to travel, because Sonia never presses the gospel on him. At the very end, she hands him a copy of the gospel, and he takes it, and he says, who knows if her faith can ever become my faith? And so it's an open question. And that's why Dostoevsky goes on in The Idiot and Devils and Adolescent and Karamazov to explore the spiritual side of that issue, where in every novel, a character goes through a a kind of death and rebirth.
Michael, as you know, we ask our editors for a Norton Library hot take, which is to say, is there something about Crime and Punishment that you feel you are swimming against the prevailing wisdom? You just see this in a completely different way. Is there a controversial take you have about this novel?
I think the epilogue is important and valid, and there are some critics who reject it and who say it's just a cheap way to end the novel. I think there are indications all along in the novel that say that Raskolnikov had a religious upbringing as a child and that he is really returning to a spirituality and a religious dimension that he had all along. And a good example is his first dream of the beaten horse, when he and his father are on their way to a graveyard outside a Russian church to bring an offering to the grandma who's dead and buried in the cemetery. And Raskolnikov runs away from his father when he sees the peasant beating the horse and embraces the horse and sympathizes with the victim rather than with the victimizer, and wakes up from his dream and says, could I really be thinking of doing something similar to the old woman? That all of Dostoevsky's characters undergo this same sort of death and rebirth in their spiritual lives.
And you're saying in Dostoevsky scholarship, there's debate about whether that epilogue enhances the book?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And some people feel it was just written hurriedly and tacked on as a way of getting out of the book. I think that's wrong. I think it's a fitting ending to poor Raskolnikov. He needs to discover that he is not only a legal criminal, but that he's a moral transgressor. And it's only then that he discovers that.
So he really comes into illumination by the end of the novel. He learns a lot about himself and his actions.
I think so.
Has Crime and Punishment been adapted in other forms in ways that our readers and listeners might appreciate?
Well, there are several films that are very good. One of them is a Soviet film that was made in the early 70s and that is shown in two parts. I saw it in 1971, and it still holds up these days if you can find it in a library. There's a British version with John Hurt playing Raskolnikov, and there's an American version. There's a good book that's published by a colleague of mine that's on film versions of Russian classics. And I can't recall his name at the moment, but film versions of Russian classics. And he analyzes all the different modalities in which Crime and Punishment has been transformed.
You were saying earlier that this is like a detective novel and a whodunit or why done it. So it seems like it would be sufficiently gripping and dramatic to adapt.
Yes, there's a television show, Memory is Not What It Used to Be, that was influenced by Raskolnikov. You'll probably remember it. It's the guy who wears a trench coat all the time and who's making wry and ironic comments.
Columbo?
Yes, thank you.
Really?
Yes.
That's influenced by Raskolnikov?
Influenced by Raskolnikov.
Incredible. I know that Crime and Punishment is hugely popular in America as a staple of reading. Does it mean something different to Russian readers?
Well, they think they understand it, and they think that nobody else does. They're not convinced that Americans can understand the Russian setting.
How so?
The isolation which Raskolnikov feels in Petersburg, the religious inspiration that Sonia can provide him with. Orthodoxy is so different from Western Christianity that the Russians think they have a monopoly on spirituality. Even Putin goes through the actions of going to church on holidays and being crowned, as it were, after his election. They think, Putin goes through these actions to convince the Russians that he's ordained as a czar, the way the old czars were.
Is there something about Dostoevsky that contemporary Russians claim the way Brits would claim Shakespeare or Americans would claim Mark Twain and have him be sort of a national author? Or was his writing too critical and challenging about the norms to reach that kind of status?
I think the emphasis on spirituality is Russian, and the depth of the psychology is Russian. These are things that Russians claim as their contribution to world culture.
What about music? Does Crime and Punishment inspire any kind of playlist in your mind?
The only song that I could think of was Connie Francis singing "Who's Sorry Now."
That's great.
That's funny that you raised that, because in my Norton Critical Edition of Notes from Underground, the first edition, I included the first two verses of Lennon and McCartney's "Nowhere's Man." He's a real nowhere's man. There was a book review of my translation in the New Republic, of all places, and I was trounced for including Lennon and McCartney in the edition of the Norton Critical Edition, and Leon Wiesenthal was the critic, and he said the fortress has fallen with the inclusion of this song, the lyrics, in the Norton Critical Edition, and he proposed having a contest and naming a song to go with each major classic in world literature. It's a very funny review.
Why not? I thought you were going to say, I fought the law and the law won, but Bobby Fuller sings that. One of the descriptions you had of Porphyry, the detective, because in the history of detective fiction, you think of Edgar Allan Poe and Javert, for instance, in Les Miserables. What is Porphyry's technique in solving? Is he a psychological detective? Is he like kind of a ruthless? Is he playing checkers or chess?
He's playing chess, and he's damn good at it. It's a new position, the examining magistrate. He's not a prosecutor, but he's an examining magistrate, and his job is to bring about a confession of the criminal, not to indict him and not to condemn him, but to have him realize where he went wrong. And Porphyry, I'm pretty sure, knows all along that Raskolnikov is the criminal, but he engineers his interviews. He has 3 major interviews with Raskolnikov. He engineers those interviews to bring Raskolnikov to confess, which Raskolnikov finally does in Book 6. Confesses the fact, as I said before, that he breaks the law and murders.
Porphyry he's seeking the effect of confession rather than proving. He wants Raskolnikov to come to this truth by himself.
Exactly. That's his job.
That's very helpful for a novelist to allow him to draw this out in such a beautiful way.
And it's the psychological depth that Dostoevsky is aiming for.
And they are intellectual equals, Porphyry and
Absolutely.
Raskolnikov.
They have these interviews, and they spar with each other in a most intriguing and entertaining way. Dostoevsky has Raskolnikov say, what does he mean? Why is he asking me that question? And then Raskolnikov will fashion an answer to one of Porfiry's questions. It's all a game of chess, and they're an equal match for each other.
Michael, maybe the last thing I'm going to ask you to consider is this book that was written in 1866, published in 1866. What is its contemporary relevance? How do we extract the themes of crime and punishment and make it speak to today's moment?
Well, the first thing that I thought about with that question is conspiracy theories, and wondered if the people who follow conspiracy theories might not find the book relevant, because other characters in the novel are trying to attach different motives to Raskolnikov's crime, and he is involved in his own search for a motive and tries them out. Another thing is the psychological depth that I keep coming back to. We're still interested in the subconscious, and we find Raskolnikov's explorations of great interest. And Dostoevsky, especially in the epilogue, Raskolnikov has a final dream in which he imagines that the world is populated by people, each of whom has a different philosophy and knows and follows his own mind, and that the result is absolute chaos and confusion, and the world falls apart as a result of their each following their own inclination to find a meaning, a theory. And it seems that the chaos of the present moment resembles that disorder that Dostoevsky foretold.
Is there any suggestion, and I know you're working also on Notes from the Underground, where Dostoevsky seems to have a lot of his characters with an excess of consciousness, almost like the stimulation from the world and from within. It's almost hard to bear, dealing with the problems of the world, dealing with society, dealing with other people. And if you are a thoughtful person or a sensitive person, it's almost torture. And I wonder if either that's a through line in Dostoevsky's work, and also if Dostoevsky could have only seen the way the 21st century would have been with outside stimulation.
We're very lucky to have the notebooks of Dostoevsky for Crime and Punishment published. And it is curious that 3 or 4 times Raskolnikov commits suicide in the notebooks. He can't stand the burden that he's followed, and he runs off and he blows his brains out. And then Dostoevsky writes in the next notebook, no, that's not it, and keeps him, revives him, because he needs him to keep on the search for the real motive for the crime.
Michael Katz, thank you so much for joining us once again on the Norton Library podcast to discuss your edition of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Thank you, Michael.
You're very welcome. Again.
The Norton Library edition of Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky, translated and edited by Michael Katz, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles.